So it's 4 o'clock here in Berlin and in Copenhagen and in Rome and also in other sort of capitals, I presume, those following us. My name is Lykke Friis. I am the director of the think tank Europa and also the co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And with those two affiliations, it is obviously a great pleasure to invite you all to this fantastic webinar on the upcoming Italian elections, because this is a production, you could say, between Think Tank Europa and the European Council on Foreign Relations in Rome, so the ECFR office. And what we'll be discussing is obviously the election in Italy on the 25th of September, on the very day where Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, came forward with a number of new proposals about the future of Europe in her State of the Union address. So the timing couldn't be better. And we have with us two excellent speakers. I mean, one will basically be the moderator, my colleague Dieter Brasso-Sørensen, Chief Analyst of Think Tank Europa. And then we have with us from Rome, we have Teresa, I have to make sure I pronounce your last name correctly, Coratella. You are the program manager at the European Council of Foreign Relations in Rome. So over to you, Dieter, and a warm welcome to you all.
Thank you, Lykke. And I'm also very happy to welcome both you, Teresa, of course, and all the listeners to today's webinar. So I've been looking very much forward to the discussions today, both to understand better what it will mean for Italian politics, but I guess also for European politics, that we'll likely see a change of power to the right in Italy. But also, I think, to understand better the role of the EU in Italian politics and the role of Draghi, who now looks to be leaving Italian politics, at least sort of for the time being. So, but before we turn to the substance, I just wanted to cover a few practicalities. So everyone besides the speakers are now muted, and we kindly ask everyone to stay muted throughout the webinar today. You are, of course, welcome to ask questions, but we kindly ask you to post your questions in the chat function, and then I'll do my very best to integrate as many questions as I can throughout our conversation today. But before we dive into the many interesting questions, I wanted to give the floor to you, Teresa, to give us an update on where things stand in Italian politics. So please, Teresa, thank you for joining today, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for having thought about me and for having invited me today to try to explain what is happening again in Italy. So while on one side having elections in Italy is not big news, I mean, we are getting quite used to it. On the other side, the very big news of this election is that finally foreign policy is a protagonist of the electoral debate. Why I'm saying this? Because the debate that all the candidates and the political leaders are pushing forward regarding sanctions and the position against Russia has a direct consequence on domestic politics and how they will tackle all the domestic issues once they will be elected and once they will be asked to form a government. Having said that, which I have to say it's a surprise for me as well, I would like to give you a very short overview of the latest polls. Please note that last Friday was the last day to show polls in Italy. This means that the figure that I will try to narrate are of almost a week ago. Things might already change. We know how citizens can be influenced by public debate, but on the same time, how not having polls and looking at numbers can also play a very important role. So according to the very latest, we know that the big winner already is Giorgia Meloni, the leader of Brothers of Italy. Just imagine that 6-7 years ago, she started with a 2%, and to date, she might reach, but we don't know, 26-27% of vote. Then we have, of course, the contenders on one side her main opponent, who is Enrico Letta. He was already a prime minister, then he left for Sciences Po, then he came back, and now he's leading the Democratic Party with about 20% of vote, or at least this is the objective that Enrico Letta is in his mind. And then the big surprise. Why I'm saying the big surprise? Because although Europe and Italy as well is talking a lot about the strength of the center-right coalition, we see today how Giorgia Meloni's two main allies, Forza Italia and the League, are not performing really well, which is already having an impact on the electoral campaign. And my very last point regards the five-step movement. Why I'm mentioning the five-step movement? Because they were the big news in the last national elections. And today they are just in the middle between trying to survive in the political landscape on one side, and on the other one, trying to give themselves a new idea of politics. So if we look today at polls, of course, the center-right coalition has definitely a majority. The center-left is quite weak at the moment, but has said we have still 2 weeks left. And as I said, foreign policy and how foreign policy is perceived by Italian citizens can really still play a major role in these elections.
Thank you, Teresa, for giving that outline. I think if we start from sort of the assumption that the most likely incoming coalition government will be a right-wing coalition consisting of the Italian Brotherhood, the League, and Forza Italy, I'm wondering whether you already touched a bit upon it, that we are 2 weeks out from the election, things might change. But are there really any plausible alternatives to this right-wing coalition? And I'm especially interested because I think when we heard early analysis of the situations, there were several commentators pointing to there might be a slim chance that the center left would be able to come together and pose a real challenge to this right-wing coalition. But that really no longer seems to be in play, and I'm just wondering why that is.
Well, I think that as of today, we might expect 3 kinds of very different scenarios. The first one is, of course, the center-right gets about 45% of votes. Giorgia Meloni receives from the head of state the mandate to form the government, and she candidates herself as the natural prime minister. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario is quite similar to the first one, with the exception that Giorgia Meloni might decide not to be the prime minister designated and choose another more not political figure. This is somehow because this is her first test as a leading prime minister, possible leading prime minister, and because she understands perfectly how being the first chance for her, this also might be the last chance for her if she fails. And then we have the third scenario. This first scenario was much stronger when thinking about a possible center-left government in the last week. Today, it seems quite a weak scenario because polls are polls and numbers are numbers and make the difference. However, this first scenario could be possible only in the situation where the center-right doesn't perform so much well. And on the other side, Enrico Letta and the Democratic Party might be able to get more votes that last poll shows, and the difference between Brothers of Italy and the Democratic Party might come out as of a very few percentages. However, Letta has a lot of challenges already ahead and a lot of issues to deal with. Having a center-left government would mean putting together really quite a big number of small parties. So parties that manage to enter the parliament, however, not with a big percentage of vote. So just imagine in the current scenario where such important decisions are to be taken. We have the budget law to be approved in December. Just imagine how much it could be difficult for a center-left leader, in this case Letta, to make everybody happy and include everybody's party priorities in the political agenda of the government.
I just wanted to ask sort of a brief follow-up questions for the second scenario that you pose, where Meloni will come in with a strong right-wing coalition, but choose not to become the prime minister, and instead choose, as you said, sort of a non-political figure to take this role. Are there any sort of indications of this being plausible? And if that was plausible, who would that person be, basically?
Also, on the first question, which is easier, I would say that she waited so much time, so many years, to have a credible position on such a big support. But on the same time, during these years, she also had the opportunity to observe her other male counterparts and to see how their political career developed and how they managed or not to bring their parties to the success and then not really big success. So she learned a lot from their mistakes, and she knows perfectly very well that today, with the war in Europe, with Europe united, with some little exception, against Russia, she needs to be the right leader to contribute to the European strategic framework with Russia. And she saw how Russia can be a very dangerous topic to deal with. So this is why I'm saying that maybe she might do this very, brave choice from her side to give up, to put aside her premiership ambitions in the name of a more I would like to avoid saying technical figure, because otherwise we always fail in this last solution in Italian politics, where we bring not political figures but technical figures as a guarantee. But she might decide to choose some more politically navigated and wise personalities. With regard on the names, there are really, a lot of ideas. She told her closest inner circle not to mention this name, because she doesn't want to, she would like to avoid the situation where something goes wrong. But she, at the same time, she's building another, I would say, parallel inner cycle of former diplomats or businessmen coming from the main Italian companies, people that can somehow contribute concretely to a kind of agenda. So let's see. What I'm sure is that in the case she does not present herself as prime minister, she will keep for herself the most important ministries, not only for the management of the Next Generation EU funds, but also those key ministries in order to have something to say in Europe.
Thank you. I think when debating sort of your third scenario, you said that it might actually be quite difficult to govern a center-left coalition. It would be a lot of small parties. Reading up for today's webinar, it seems that there are also sort of frictions within the right-wing coalition, and you already mentioned that they see differently on issues such as EU's positions towards Russia, the sanctions, how to deal with the energy crisis, and so forth. So I'm wondering, what about the right-wing coalition? Will it be functional, stable? Like, what is the longevity of such a coalition in your mind?
Well, in my mind, my current picture is that there can be two possible scenarios. The first one is that all the three coalition parties get what they're thinking about today in terms of vote. So they are satisfied by the electoral results. And on the other side, we have a second option where only Giorgia Meloni gets the desired bunch of votes, and the other two partners become very junior kids partners, I would say. In both scenarios, the distribution of the balance of power will be the very first challenge and the most tricky challenge for all of them, not only for Giorgia Meloni, but also for Berlusconi and Salvini to preserve their power or what they think is their political leverage inside the coalition. In the first case, if all of them manage to get what they want, I think we will have some month of continuity, some month of well-functioning government, not because of big efforts from the winners, but because they will benefit of all the reforms and decisions taken by the previous government led by Draghi. So they will have some months to benefit from this. The tricky part will come out with the budget law to be approved and with the new year, where we will fully enter in the phase of dealing with the energy consequences of the war, the consequences on inflation. So I think the first months will be a money hunt months. Then we will see what will happen. The big obstacle, I think, that after the formation of the government and the parliament will be Russia. As today Ursula von der Leyen stated, I mean, the EU position against Russia and in dealing with Russia is confirmed, is not going to change. Sanctions will stay there. So I will be curious to see what now Salvini or Berlusconi how they're reacting to these wars. Because if on one side, I'm sure that Giorgia Meloni will stick to her position on Putin and Russia decision to invade Ukraine. On the other side, Berlusconi and Salvini, it took really too much time for them to make a kind of diplomatic condemnation of the invasion. So that would be, in my opinion, the biggest obstacle she will have to deal with inside the coalition.
Thank you. I think you already touched upon Meloni is sort of in reality the big winner of this election, and the trajectory of the Italian Brotherhood is quite amazing. It's a very rapid increase in votes over a very short period of time. I'm wondering whether both Meloni and also the Italian Brotherhood, they have been the only political opposition to Draghi's Rainbow Coalition, and I'm wondering to what extent her rising success can be explained by her sort of monopolizing this oppositional space in Italian politics. So whether it's put differently, whether it's in fact sort of a mirror effect of this very broad coalition that we've seen under Draghi.
I would say that she's benefiting from two elements. The first one is the one you already mentioned. She was the only opposition party, and we know, I think, in every EU member state or in every country in the world where you stay at the opposition, you have a lot of possibilities and chances to make your voice heard. And in this case, if you are the only one staying at the opposition, these chances increase and increase. On the other side, there is the other, and probably this is what any opposition party after the election will do. So, I mean, it's normal politics. On the other side, I think that she's really benefiting from the fact that center-right voters in Italy today, they don't know who to vote. And I explained this by saying that still 32% of the Italian citizens said that they don't know who to vote. And why? I mean, if I look at the League in the last years seated in 3 different governments. The first one with the Five Star Movement, then they moved to the Draghi, sorry, 2 governments, to the Draghi government. So just imagine how the League citizens, who are very peculiar citizens in Italy because they are geographically to be located mainly in the north of Italy, can feel today. On the other side, we have Berlusconi. Berlusconi has failed. We can say this openly because it's a very important reflection that the party is doing also publicly. Has failed in being recognized as a liberal rightist leader. He failed in this. And at the moment, with the Forza Italia having something like 5 or 6%, it is very unlikely that after the election, the party will survive as it is. And maybe there is a third reason behind this. Giorgia Meloni, through her very simple nationalist and sovereignty-based way of talking and speaking to citizens, probably today represents the most simple way of doing politics and reaching out to citizens and to possible voters. So I think she got perfectly how to handle the electoral campaign. And while the others were at the government and they were doing governmental business and things, she was at the opposition and she had all the time to build her narrative, the opposition narrative. So I think that things were quite easy for her, and I think that it was a very smart move from her side to choose to stay at the opposition.
Thank you for sort of presenting this overview. As you said this, I think it becomes clear to me again that there are a number of political figures in this incoming coalition that are known to be rather controversial. And I'm wondering, because I guess any incoming government would have to be approved by the Italian president. And we have Mattarella, he's sitting his 2nd term, and he has this reputation, and I might be wrong here, but for being somewhat interventionist. He has previously denied a minister. He's proceeded over an inserted prime minister, Draghi. I guess my question would be sort of what are the chances that Mattarella would intervene in the incoming government and the sort of the minister lineup? And if he were to intervene, how would this be perceived in Italian politics?
Well, I would like to avoid to speak in the name of my head of state, which I respect so much, but based on what he already did in the last year, apart from jokes, but based on what he already did in last years, where, for example, he rejected the nomination of a clearly, openly anti-EU candidate for Europe minister, this prerogative can be still used and it's still in place. Sometimes I think that the role of the head of state in Italy is seen more like a kind of representation role, while our constitution clearly says that his role is to preserve the constitution, and preserving the constitution means preserving the country from every kind of instability effect and instability factor. One thing that our head of state in the recent years really proved to be very good at is the power of speech, the power of his words. He was in Tirana last week during an institutional journey, and he not only mentioned, the current state of issues of Europe, but he reminded European leaders how the importance of an energy strategy on Russia is still lacking and how this is badly needed. So I think that the power of his words sometimes can be more effective than the power of his actions. So let's see. I mean, a lot depends on the list of people that any kind of prime minister will decide to present to him. And I have to be honest that I think that in the case of Giorgia Meloni, as I said, she learned a lot from her predecessor mistake, and she's already doing a very important scouting job of trying to bring to bear around the table, her table, knowledgeable people and experienced people that could represent a good card for her at the eyes of the head of state.
Thank you. So I wanted to sort of briefly just take a step back from the incoming or the possibly incoming coalition government and discuss the man who will no longer be the Italian prime minister, namely Mario Draghi. I think to understand, or that's at least my take, that to understand present day Italian politics, it's also necessary to sort of dive into the question of why Draghi was made prime minister in the first place, and why he's not prime minister anymore. He's not prime minister in the near term future. I think in particular, I would very much like to hear your thoughts on whether the opposition that Draghi has faced is an effect of him sort of revealing his political stripes during his time as a prime minister, or whether he's still this sort of political enigma that you can sort of insert if you wish something governed and stabilized. What's your thoughts on his sort of reign?
Well, to answer this question, I would like to say that since the very beginning, when he got the job, Draghi was completely aware of who to trust and not to trust inside this big coalition he managed to put together. And at the end, his initial thoughts and ideas were correct and right. So that's the starting point. I mean, he managed to be chosen as a prime minister because, of course, his personal history in Europe. He's among the most respected leaders, and the way he managed to convince France and Germany, which were facing very difficult political times, to follow him on some key European dossier like energy, the support to Ukraine, and he was almost starting also to build this new consensus on a new plan on migration. This confirms how his credibility at the European and international level. There is no doubt about it. Looking, however, at domestic politics, this support was not, of course, at the same level. I think he got a very governmental support, but he didn't get the political support he needed among the party members of the coalition. And to be very frank, I think that many of the parties of the coalition were just looking to have snap elections, to have early elections. However, I don't think they expected these elections to come so early. I think that they hoped to have these elections maybe in January after the budget law was approved, which is going to be a very big challenge for the new government. So they made a very wrong calculation and the evaluation of the situation. The only party that had all the interest to have very early elections, it's of course Brothers of Italy, who was sitting at the opposition. This confirms the confusion that there was behind this government in terms of political balances inside the coalition. And Draghi did the only thing that he could do, even if he got the support. The votes were so low that he acknowledged the fact that nothing was to be done, and that the government would have not last until election. So he made the only decision that he could make in last July.
Mm-hmm. So you already touched a bit upon it, but I wanted to ask you anyway, sort of what in your view will the legacy of Draghi be now? Before him being Prime Minister of Italy, he was Super Mario, he was the savior of the euro. Now he has his term as Italian Prime Minister. How will this affect his sort of political legacy?
So much is said in Italy, I think, on a daily basis from almost all leaders that we need to put forward the Draghi agenda. Looking to date at the Italian electoral debate, I could say that only few are still trying to put forward this famous Draghi agenda, and basically it is limited to what to do with Russia and with sanctions. So I would say that the biggest legacy for him, in my personal opinion, was his ability to push the European leaders behind their traditional views, to push them to overcome some very traditional and historical foreign policy limits. Let's look at Germany and the debate, the huge debate that has taken place in Germany and still is taking place. Maybe there were two missing opportunities that I'm sure he would have fulfilled in case of his stay. The first one, as I said, migration. I would have preferred to see a Draghi agenda also on migration, not as a kind of justifying agenda for Italy, but rather as a proposal for a real strategic and long-term European strategy on how to deal with migration, how to deal with the refugees. I mean, what today Ursula von der Leyen said about the fact that the Ukrainian refugee management was an exception, but it cannot remain as an exception. I think that this perfectly matches what Draghi had in mind. And the third legacy, missing, I think, legacy, it's more about China. Less has been said about. A lot has been said about what Draghi did, his position on Russia, but less on what he did on China. His government applied many times a very important rule, which is called the Golden Rule. So the prerogative of the government to stop any acquisition of Italian national champions by foreign agents, by foreign actors, or however you want to call them. That was very important, especially in the technological field, which is now a very critical and important field for Europe. So I think that his legacy remains strong, but he could have done more if he had more political time to devote to this.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, so Draghi's resignation, it unleashed, and the two of us has had this conversation before, but it unleashed sort of a widespread international outcry, which at least underscored, I think, the international fear that Italy will struggle without a figure like Draghi. Whoever will be governing Italy, Draghi will be missed. I think one could say that it was somewhat puzzling, given that Draghi was on his way out anyway. He was never meant to stay on as a prime minister. He was not for election. But I would like to hear your thoughts on the European and international reactions to Draghi's resignation and this outcry that we saw.
Well, I have to say, very positively surprised, and I don't mind if my French and German colleagues hear me today, but it was a very unprecedented crying out. I think before the government collapsed, basically, we reached a kind of perfect momentum for European politics, a perfect political momentum where we had among the three leading economies in Europe finally talking to each other also on a political level and trying to convince not only the other member states, and we know how many reluctant member states we had after Russia invaded Ukraine, but also Washington, so our US partner, but mainly to prove that Europe this time could deal in a very credible, coherent, of course with difficulties, because we still have to remember that we are 27 different capitals, with Warsaw having very different interests from Rome or Madrid. So I think that that perfect momentum was broken, also because the other two parts of this machinery, so Berlin and Paris, were not really dealing well with their internal dynamics and internal politics. Macron won the elections, but in a very different way from the first election he won. Scholz took really some time, first of all, to overcome the Merkel legacy, but also to build his position as a European leader. I mean, the Prague speech has been very criticized, but in my opinion, at least it showed a kind of will from Scholz to be a European leader and not only a German leader. So I think it should be appreciated. But then what we have in Europe, we have still the Visegrad group, although Poland and Hungary are divided today on the position on Russia. And it will be interesting to see how Giorgia Meloni might get from this division between Hungary and Poland in terms of alliances inside Europe. We still have Visegrad, we still have some member states which are facing very important economic, social, and financial problems still linked to the pandemic and now due to the war. So it's really a pity that this political momentum got broken, and whoever will be the next Prime Minister of Italy, I think will take a lot of time, really a lot of time, to build personal bilateral relations with both Macron and Scholz. But also it will be very interesting to see if this new Prime Minister will manage to somehow to sit again around this very important political table. It will take months to do this, to understand how to do this, but time runs out. So I see quite a good bunch of difficulties in this process today.
Mm-hmm. So having discussed sort of the European leaders' response to Draghi's resignation, I wanted to touch upon sort of the broader discussion of how the Italian election will impact not only Italian politics, but also European politics. And just recalling Ursula von der Leyen's State of the European Union speech this morning, I wanted to get your take on how this change of government that we're facing might impact sort of future European discussions. And that's of course very broad. So just to throw some themes out there that I think would be quite important. I'm especially thinking on the European position on Ukraine, Russia, and the related energy crisis. I think it's also important that we touch on the revision of the Growth and Stability Pact. And then thirdly, and you already mentioned this as something that Draghi potentially could have done, but didn't do. We heard that the negotiations on the migration pacts are reopening with the aim to reach some kind of agreement on what European solidarity will look like before the European parliamentary elections in 24. And on those issues, and I know they're very broad and large, how do you think the change of government in Italy will affect the European discussions around those issues?
Well, starting from Russia and the linked, of course, sanctions and energy issues. In a case of a center-right coalition with the Brothers of Italy as a majority party, consider Giorgia Meloni words and stance against Putin, why one might say, okay, we're safe, we will have Italy supporting the EU common position. However, if Salvini is in the government, will be in the government, I think that Salvini could be the challenger of this Italian support to the European unity on Russia and sanctions. So the next prime minister will have a very difficult task in trying to keep her or his allies in a joint unity and position in supporting Europe. That will be very tricky. And that's, I think, the main challenge for the next government to deal with. On the Stability and Growth Pact, I would like to make a very honest sentence and statement. Italy at the moment really does not have a clear plan on how to contribute of any kind of revision and of this pact, because looking at the possible coalition partners, on one side we have Salvini who wants to challenge completely every kind of European architecture, the financial and economic included. So, and this could represent a problem. On the other side, you have Giorgia Meloni, who till now really do not have a plan on this regard. Yesterday, there was a very interesting discussion organized by a fellow think tank, YAI, with representatives of different parties. And there was Giorgia Meloni candidate. And she said that the objective of the party once in Europe won't be to challenge Europe, but to reform constructively Europe. This sentence of reforming constructively Europe can have a lot of definitions. We will see after the elections. And the main, factor that will have an influence of how Italy might want to reform constructively is how Italy and the new government will decide to deal with EU funds, implementations of EU funds, if the new government will decide to continue with what has been done, or if they will decide to challenge all this tool. So at the moment, I think that economy, apart the electoral debate around inflation and the increase of prices, is completely out of any political agenda of the next government. And on migration, I think this is the real Achilles wheel for the next government. I don't need to recall how Italy dealt with migration in the last governments, and Salvini and Meloni position on migration maybe is the only point where the two allies really agree on. A complete closing of borders, an alignment with Orban on migration, on the pre-invasion of Ukraine, Poland, because we always need to remember that if Poland showed great and is still showing great solidarity with Ukrainian refugees, the situation before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and how the Polish government was posing itself on migration was completely different. So I think that on migration, Meloni and Salvini position will be much closer to the Orban and peace position rather than and less closer to a European different way of dealing with migration. Ursula von der Leyen today's speech was also quite clear on this. Solidarity should remain the key pillar. Humanitarian support, the respect of human rights, they all should be the values around which a new migration policy should be built in Europe. And I don't see at the moment any of the two leaders why Berlusconi is, I don't think is much interested on the topic, making a reference to these values and pillar. The position they have is quite the opposite. And this is where Italy can be really the troublemaker inside Europe once the new election is formed, not on Russia, not on stability and growth, but rather on migration. That will be, in my opinion, a very critical point of confrontation between Italy and the other member states.
Just a quick follow-up on your thoughts on their position on migration. So I get that you can have as a political priority that you want to close the border, so uphold the external borders of the Union. That was also mentioned by Ursula von der Leyen today in her speech. So that is an important part of sort of the how to govern this issue. But I assume in my mind that would be a bit of wishful thinking to say that will solve the problem completely. That we'll have no migrants, no refugees entering the Union merely because we're getting better and at sort of enforcing our borders. Do they have any thoughts on redistribution among member states of refugees and migrants, or is it merely sort of a discussion about the external border?
Yes, Ursula von der Leyen today spoke about the control of European borders, but always in line with the respect of human rights and any kind of humanitarian approach that Europe can use in this. On the other side, there is no mention in the Italian electoral debate today about quotas or redistribution. It's a pure propaganda on just closing down borders with any kind of negotiation, any kind of debate is just a matter of closing borders because of national security. National security in terms of economic security and of national interest. And it's very paradoxical to see how this narrative was pushed forward by Salvini with the migration crisis that hit Europe, but it didn't evolve at all through the pandemic and after Russia decided to invade Ukraine. It's always the same. It's 6-7 years that it's the same. So this gives you the sense of how there is no strategy behind this. It's just a very populist and simple way of hoping to catch votes in the name of preserving the interests of Italian citizens and Italian citizens' security. So there is no strategy behind this. It's just applying the same political declaration every time an election come out. And that's the main point. I would appreciate more having a government with a different view from the European values view, but at least with a concrete strategy and idea. In this case, we have just an electoral and propagandistic approach to the issue.
Mm-hmm. And how does it, when the Italian population is surveyed, surveyed, how does this issue pan out? How big of an issue is this actually to the Italian population, not only in political rhetoric, but comparing it to, let's say, the economy, climate, the war in Ukraine, other big issues? Is this really how big of a concern, I think, is my question, is this to the Italian population?
Well, that's, I think, an excellent question to explain more into my idea, my sensitivity behind this. If you look at polls among the Italian population, even before the pandemic, you might be very surprised to see how among Italians' top priorities, worrying priorities, there's no migration. It's economic stability, financial stability, and immigration. This is another very important pillar of the disinformation campaign that has been pushed forward by the populist parties in Italy in the last year. Italians are more concerned about their immigration rather than migration, and this is confirmed by numbers and polls. And this is where, in my opinion, those leaders claiming a closing down of the borders their view really clash with the public opinion and the citizen view, which at the end is the view of those who will go and vote or not for them. So this, just to explain, this helps me in explaining how there is really a discrepancy between the political leaders' electoral campaign views and the real citizens' state of mind at the moment. Migration is not really at the top of priorities for Italian citizens. And for example, very surprisingly, with the pandemic, after the pandemic started, climate became to be among the priorities for Italians. And it's really surprising because we, unlike other European member states, we don't have a solid green tradition, political tradition. We don't have a Green Party. The only Green Party is now in the Democratic Party governmental alliance, but does not have any impact. And seeing how Italians see climate more worrying than migration, this just gives you the sense of how this debate, electoral debate, is sometimes dystopic and very far from the reality.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to jump a bit. You already touched upon economic stability being a great concern for Italian voters, and I wanted to make sure that we just at least get some minutes to discuss sort of the state of Italian economy and how this plays into the election campaign. So Italy's debt to GDP ratio is over 150% now, so that's higher than during the Eurozone crisis, and that is a situation that's difficult to sustain unless you have either very rapid economic growth, you have very harsh financial policies, or you have a market who trusts that the Italian government will be able to manage its debt and thus keeps the interest rate low. So I'm wondering, two questions basically. What do you expect of the incoming government in terms of financial policies? So here we're touching on reform agenda, issues like that. And how do you expect markets will react to the incoming Italian government?
So on your first questions regarding reforms, our reforms are, and in the very long medium term, will be strictly linked and depending on EU funds. I mean, whatever comes as a prime minister will have to deal with this reality, and we'll have to tackle the consequences of not implementing the reforms that Europe asked us and for which the EU gave us the biggest amount of all the recovery funds available. today Ursula von der Leyen said that the EU has already disbursed 100 billion euros, but there are still 700 left. And among those 700, there is a very nice Italian flag on, which means that we are responsible as the third European economy, for the fulfillment of the reforms that we committed to. So the next government will for sure benefit of the reforms already set by Draghi and the Draghi government, but these reforms need to go ahead. And I would like to see any new prime minister stopping this process and putting at risk such an important amount of funds. Because I know that we Italians always keep to feel as the protagonist of any process, but in this case, number tell the reality, are the reality. If Italy fails to use the money allocated to Europe, I mean, we have a very big and huge problem to deal with. So I would suggest, if I would be asked by any prime minister what not to do, I would say, please don't start with challenging something that has already been agreed and something on which everybody will depend on. Today we have a lot of the big problem in Europe, but we see this across all member states. It's inflation. That would be, I mean, a huge problem for political leaders to deal with, how to explain their citizens and voters what to do with inflation. And we're seeing how inflation is already having an impact in other member states. Let's see Germany, let's see also Poland, that soon we go to the new elections. So the next prime minister, I would suggest him or her to look carefully to what is already going on around in Europe. Italy can rely on a very important industrial asset. We cannot deny this, but being a champion in some fields does not prevent you to make mistakes in dealing with reforms and improvements. So this is a very delicate thing that any new prime minister will have to deal with sooner or later. I mean, it's not just about reforms. It's the reform in the key sectors that are having a huge impact even before the war. So technology, climate, infrastructures, these are all sectors which, by the way, can be easily affected by foreign interventions, by foreign influence. And if Italy wants really to contribute to Europe as a sovereign actor in these key fields, it first needs to look at its own business. And I think that Giorgia Meloni, I'm talking about her as the leader of the party with the major support at the moment, knows this, and this is why she's keeping the right distance on the topic at the moment. She wants to understand very well before talking and claiming things, how to deal with it.
Thank you. So we're almost pushing on the hour, so I don't think we have time for further questions. I wanted to thank you, Teresa, for taking part today and helping us understand better Italian politics and what to expect in the last weeks of campaign, and also how to understand the incoming government. I think that's been enlightening and very interesting. So thank you. I wanted to say to all listeners that there'll be a recorded version of the webinar up on Think Tank Europa's website tomorrow or later in the week. And I also wanted to say that we have an upcoming webinar on the Bulgarian election that will be September 27th. So please join for that as well. And once again, Teresa, thank you so much for joining today and sharing your thoughts with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it was a real pleasure for me as well. Thank you.
Thank you.